Hey guys, we're gonna start this video off today a little differently. The story of Maria Elena Hoyos and Carl Tanzler is disturbing, morbid, and not for the faint of heart. It's one of those that stays with you and haunts you long after you listen to it. If you're squeamish or have small children in the room, I suggest that you stop listening now. Those of you who are still with me, my kindred spirits who are willing to brave the most gruesome of tales, prepare yourselves, because there'll be few stories in this world that'll hit you as hard as this one. Are you ready? Then take my hand, hold it tight, and let's walk into the darkness together. Georg Carl Tanzler was born on February 8, 1877 in Dresden, Germany. As a child and later in life while traveling through Italy, Carl swore that he had these visions of a dead ancestor by the name of Countess Anna Constantia von Kassel, who informed him that he was from her bloodline and therefore a count. She also told him that the love of his life was a dark-haired, exotic woman, and she revealed to him an image of the said woman. You'd think that she'd give him just a tad more to go on, like a name or a residing country, right? But no. Apparently, she did come back to him various times with the same exact information until it was drilled into his head, though. Now, in spite of believing these visions and taking them as truth, he still decided to marry a woman by the name of Doris Schaefer in 1920 and fathered two daughters, Aisha and Clarissa, the later sadly passing away when she was just 10 years old from diphtheria. But that's a bit later. Right now, he grew up in Germany, he's having these visions, and once he's older, for some unknown reason, he finds himself in India. He traveled from there to Australia with a plan to move on quickly to the South Sea Islands. He had planned to only stay long enough to gather provisions, equipment, and some decent boats, but the weather and bad sailing conditions ended up keeping him there for a little longer, and that snowballed into him purchasing an organ, boats, property in the area. He even purchased an island in the Pacific, according to him, that is. He also began to learn about engineering and electrical work and was quite interested in it. All of this kept Carl in Australia for around 10 years, and he might have stayed longer if World War I had not begun at the time. British military authorities put him in a concentration camp, along with other officers who were prisoners of war. He was later moved to a prison that resembled a castle on cliffs called Trial Bay. When the war ended, they refused to let any of the prisoners return home. They were sent instead to Holland. Once he was able to leave there, he went directly to his mother, whom he hadn't seen in a very long time, and stayed by her side for a total of 3 years. And in this time is when he meets and marries Doris. His mother then suggests that they go to where his sister lived in the US. So on February 6, 1926, Carl leaves Rotterdam, Germany, and heads for Zephyrhills, Florida, where his sister lived. He left Doris and his daughters behind for the time, but they joined him later on. Once he gets to the US, he drops his birth name and becomes Carl von Kassel, taking the name of his envisioned countess ancestor. I'm not sure if he added the count part to the legal paperwork, but he sure did tell everyone that would listen. In fact, people who knew Carl called him eccentric, and for good reason. Carl would walk around with a cane and show off fancy watches that he swore the Tsar of Russia had given to him. He also claimed to have a total of 9 university degrees and a bunch of medals, all which were proven to be fake. Basically, whatever he knew on any subject was self-taught through reading up on it. He did, however, have a pension from World War I, so he had the money to pull off the look of whatever he claimed he was. Not long after arriving in the US, he was given a job at the Marine Hospital in Key West as a radiology technician. Here is where the story gets weird, and Carl starts to go from eccentric slowly into full-blown psychotic. One day, as Carl is doing his job at the hospital, a young woman by the name of Maria Elena Milagro Hoyos comes in for treatment, and imagine the surprise that Carl felt when he realized that the girl standing right in front of him was the one his ancestor had showed him in the vision. It was the love of his life, right in the flesh. Maria Elena Hoyos, better known to all as Elena, was a Cuban American beauty born on July 31st, 1909, in Key West, Florida. She is said to have been so beautiful that tourists would stop her on the streets just to take a picture. She was a normal girl who loved to sing, dance, and cook. She was also a devout Catholic and shy, the middle child to parents Francisco and Aurora Hoyos. When she was 16, Elena married a man named Luis Mesa and became pregnant. Unfortunately, she miscarried. She was, of course, affected by this and became sad. She then began to cough, and her parents, for some strange reason, thought it was due to her sadness, so they didn't think much about it. Luis then left Elena and moved to Miami around the same time as her cough began to worsen. On April 22, 1930, Elena's parents took her to the Marine Hospital where she met Carl. At the time, Elena was 21 years old and Carl was 53, but that didn't stop him from falling immediately and madly in love with Elena. When Elena was diagnosed with tuberculosis, Carl said that he'd do whatever it took to cure Elena, and he offered his services to the family free of charge. Elena's father was a cigar maker in a factory, and her mother worked as a maid, so they didn't have much money, and when Carl offered, they immediately jumped at the chance to give their daughter medical treatment free of charge from someone who was supposed to know what they were doing. They probably felt blessed to have met this sweet, helpful man who wanted to help their daughter. Carl wasted no time and got to work. He filled the Hoyos household with gadgets and equipment to treat Elena. He also began to concoct what he called potions and wines that he'd give her to drink. Remember, this man was self-taught and medicine at the time was nowhere near what it is today. So it's no surprise that with these two facts combined, he didn't get very far with the curing. But as he did this, he also tried to court Elena. He showered her with gifts, buying her jewelry, clothing, perfumes, you name it. When Elena's sister Florinda, or Nana as she was called, married a man named Mario Medina, Carl decided it was time to shoot his shot and he asked Elena to marry him that very night. She refused, which devastated him but did not deter him. The man was persistent and continued to try, but every time he fired a proposal at her, Elena would turn him down with the same answer. He was just too old for her, and she felt nothing for him. She also reminded him that she was still a married woman. I imagine that Carl didn't tell her that he was married as well, or that would have been at the top of the list of her excuses. Still, he continued and remained stubborn as all hell. He even named one of his inventions after her, a plane that he had been constructing which would be able to not only fly, but also sail on the water. He'd tell her that one day they'd fly away together on the Countess Elena. Eventually, things got so bad with his persistence that Elena's mother became upset and kicked him out of their home. Elena's sister Nana told the Miami Herald that Elena never loved Tanzler. She was only nice to him because my mother told her that she should be kind to those who were kind to her. She looked upon Van Kazel as a grandfather, and when he proposed marriage, she always told him, "You are too old. Why, you're old enough to be my grandfather." The family also had reservations about the way he had been treating Elena's sickness with his devil machines. So they began to avoid him, or tried to at least. They even moved without telling him, but Carl scoured the streets every night until a neighbor of the Hoyos took pity on him and told him where they were. Eventually the family gave in and accepted him back as their caregiver since Elena was only getting worse and they understood she wasn't going to recover. So things continued as they were before. Carl treated her illness while her family hoped for a miracle, and he continued to try and push marriage on Elena through the whole ordeal. By this time, Elena hated him. The treatments he gave her were super painful, and the constant turmoil that had been going on between Carl and her family must have been a lot for someone who was that sick. His constant proposals couldn't have helped either. Her sister Nana told the Miami Herald that he told her father once that if there wasn't a wedding soon, there would be a funeral. According to one of Elena's cousins who told the Tennessean Sun, The last two treatments were so terrible that she refused to let Carl know she was dying until it was too late and she was gone. It seems the family followed her wishes. On October 25th, 1931, Elena passed away almost 3 months after turning 22. As she requested, Carl wasn't informed until she was gone. They say that he was outraged at not being told sooner because he felt he could save her. He signed her death certificate and stated the cause of death to be expiration from a series of violent seizures clinically associated with dormant epilepsy. Okay. Carl did pay for her funeral as any good obsessed lover would do, and he also paid for a mausoleum to be made for her as well as her burial. Some say that he managed to convince Elena's family to rent out Elena's room to him for $20, and I honestly don't buy that at all. If things were as bad as they say between some weird old man and my kid, I don't care how broke I am or if my kid's dead. There is no way I'm letting him into my house or anywhere near her things. But anyway, he built this elaborate thing and buried Elena in it. He conveniently forgot that she was still married when she died and made a plaque with her maiden name instead. The mausoleum he built had lighting and even a telephone installed so that he could talk to Elena, and he had her placed in an airtight casket with formaldehyde to preserve her. For 2 years he visited her corpse nightly, bringing her gifts of all kinds. Apparently he thought that when he visited her, Elena's spirit would come join him. He'd sing to her and she'd tell him to take her away from there. So one day after 2 years of those nightly visits, Carl made his way to the mausoleum with a toy wagon. He took Elena's remains and tossed them in the wagon and then moved it to his laboratory, where he then began to reconstruct her piece by piece. He reattached the bones together with piano wire and replaced her decomposed eyes with pretty new glass ones. To fix her skin, Carl placed pieces of silk dipped in plaster of Paris and wax on the area and kind of molded it to create a natural look. If the act wasn't so creepy, you could actually admire his dedication and hard work. He also used her hair in a wig that Elena's mother herself had given him at some point for some unknown reason, and he filled her chest and abdominal cavities with rags to keep her original form intact. He did also install a tube down there so that he could have a fully working girlfriend that he could have intimacy with. And he then dressed her in nice clothes, stockings, jewelry, and even gloves. Eventually, Carl made the move and took her from his laboratory to his home, where he kept her in his bed, sitting in chairs, all as if she was still alive. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's so unsanitary, right? Not to worry, Carl had that covered as well. He used disinfectants and preserving agents by the truckloads. Carl even made sure to use good amounts of perfume. This kept Elena smelling fresh, clean, and helped to hold off decomposition. In 1940, 9 years after Elena passed away, and 7 after Carl made himself a makeshift bride out of her body, Elena's sister Nana had heard rumors that Carl had been seen buying copious amounts of women's items, and other rumors about a boy who was Carl's neighbor who had looked through a window and had seen Carl dancing with a life-size doll. She decided to visit Carl and confront him about these rumors. To her horror, Carl didn't deny it. Instead, he opened the door and took Nana to her sister's body, who was sitting in a chair at the time. Nana immediately called the authorities and they arrested Carl. He was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. They did give him a psychiatric evaluation and found him in a borderline state, but ultimately sane and competent enough to stand trial. The media had a field day with the case. They chose to portray Carl as a lovesick man who only wanted to be with the woman he loved. And following suit, people all over the country began to romanticize the situation, and before you knew it, Carl's hideous crime became a sort of twisted love story. People traveled to Key West to see him and give him treats. He even had an attorney offer to represent him pro bono. On October 9, 1940, at the Monroe County Courthouse in Key West, there was a preliminary hearing where the case against Carl was dropped because of the statute of limitations. He did have the nerve to ask the judge if he could have Elena back, and of course, he was denied. For some strange reason, Elena's body was put on public display for everyone to see. Over 6,800 people viewed her at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home. They even closed schools early so the kids could make it to the viewing, which makes me wonder if it's not just Carl but the whole island that was slightly morbid back then. After the viewing, it was decided between the undertaker Benjamin Sawyer, the cemetery sexton Otto Bethel, and the chief of police Bienvenido Perez that the three would be the only ones to know the new location of Elena's grave, so that Carl couldn't steal her again because, let's face it, he 1000% would. So they took Elena's body, they chopped it back up into pieces, and they placed it in an 8-inch metal box. They then buried it and took the secret of the location to their graves. This should be the end of the story, but it's not. There's a small bit left that's just as gruesome, if not more. So, Carl began to charge 25 cents to tell his macabre tale to anyone who wanted to hear it, and gave them a tour of the house he shared with Elena's body as well. Eventually, the curiosity died off, and once they stopped coming around, Carl decided to skip town and move back to Zephyrhills to be near his sister Aunt Doris, who actually helped support him towards the end of his life, which makes her one hell of a better person than I'd have been after all that. However, before he left Key West, he did do one last thing. He blew up the mausoleum he had built for Elena. On July 3rd, 1952, Carl was discovered on the floor of his home, dead behind an organ he owned. In the home, they also found a life-size wax effigy of, you guessed it, Elena. Turns out Carl had made a death mask of Elena before she was buried and had it nice and hidden in case of an emergency. So, without the real Elena, he decided to pull it out and create a wax doll to slip the mask on. At least that's what the official story says. There are certain rumors out there that claim that his obsession drove him on a non-stop search for Elena's body. He found it, and that's when he left Key West. And that would mean that the effigy found in his home was actually Elena's body, reconstructed yet again. By that time, all of Elena's close relatives had passed long ago from tuberculosis and thankfully didn't have to deal with all the new drama. The last and worst of it, though, comes years later. While renovating Carl's old home, the renovators found a note behind the wall that was allegedly written by Carl. In it, Carl confesses to killing Elena by poisoning her, stating, "She died because I gave this to her mercifully. I mixed the root of wolfsbane with aconite diluted. It was palatable, and my loved one departed from this miserable world on October 25th, 1931. Suffer no more, sweet Elena. I have sent you to the angels with my golden elixir." They found bottles of this golden elixir behind the wall as well, but they had all been shattered. The chief of police, Bienvenido Perez, recounted how Carl had once said to him, "I have spent my whole life searching for Elena. 50 years ago she appeared to me in a vision, and she promised then to be my bride. Now I've found her, and I'll kill her if necessary to fulfill my destiny." So between this and the threat that I mentioned earlier about no wedding equals funeral, I'd say that his involvement in her death is very plausible. What really makes me cringe is that I have absolutely no doubt that if there really is an afterlife, then Carl is definitely still stalking Elena as we speak. That's it. That's all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments if you think Carl's a creeper, just a man desperately in love, or if he's just flat out psycho. Also, let me know what you think about that note and whether you think he had something to do with Elena's death. And don't forget, like if you liked and subscribe if you want more. See you next time.